From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Donald Trump's second administration starts to take shape. We'll have details on the names we know and how likely they are to influence economic policy. A conversation with Doug Rediker of International Capital.
Plus, special counsel Jack Smith acts to pause the federal prosecution of Trump while Democrats fret over the future of the Supreme Court. Elizabeth Wydra of the Constitutional Accountability Center will join us for more.
All this with control of the House and 2 Senate seats still too close to call. We'll get the latest on that. And another story we're following this hour, a phone call between Trump, Elon Musk, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy. Thanks for being with us on the late edition of Balance of Power. You made it to Friday. It's been a long week for those of us watching politics and, of course, a nation watching the outcomes slowly evolving from our elections on Tuesday. A slew of names now as we turn to the transition being talked about for cabinet positions in a Trump administration. And according to sources, a new one this past hour, Alabama Representative Mike Rogers being considered to be the head of the Defense Department. Joining us now with more, Bloomberg's Scully and Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari. This latest name hitting the tape here, Megan, how likely is it to happen?
You know, we're hearing so many names at this point, it's hard to say anyone that is likely. Mike Rogers is, as you mentioned, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He is not quite in the isolationist camp that many of folks in Trump world are. If he were running the Defense Department, he would be coming at it as more of a traditional defense hawk, although he and Trump have gotten close in recent years, so he could be skewed. But it would be an interesting pick, to say the least. Complicating it, though, as you mentioned, the House is still up for grabs, and it could be really close. That choosing a House Republican or two could be enough to kind of upend who has control of that chamber. Well, so that could work against him.
Yeah, Megan, I'm so glad you brought that up because, Jonathan, to bring you in here, other names we've been floated that we understood could be looking for positions in this administration or a White House, like, say, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. I do wonder how many people realistically could be pulled from the House of Representatives in this administration if it is to be a narrow majority.
Yeah, I mean, as Megan points out, the size of the majority could determine how many folks from the House or from the Senate that can be pulled in, because you don't want to open up a situation where you have a vacancy for some period of time that prevents the House from doing the work that Republicans are going to want to do, assuming they do hold the majority. And we don't actually know at this point, A, if they will be in the majority, even though it appears likely, and B, if they do, it could be so slim. And even if they are able to take 1 or 2 people, remember how hard it's been this past Congress for the House to pass even their own conservative bills. Yeah. I don't think those dynamics are going to change significantly. So reducing the margin for error might, undercut this rare opportunity they have with a trifecta here of control of all the levers of power.
Throw a few more names down. Robert Lighthizer, according to the FT, has been asked to be U.S. Trade Representative once again. We also have heard from the FT Linda McMahon at the Commerce Department, which does not come as a surprise to most people who have been watching this. But talk to us about the House a little bit more, Megan, because this is a massive, outstanding issue from our elections on Tuesday night, realizing we might not know until next week once results come in from California. The big prize here with 52 seats, the biggest delegation in the country. We're told Democrats still have a path. How do you see it?
So the way I see it now, I think the last time I looked, the breakdown was 211 Republicans to 199 Democrats right now. The majority needs to get to 218. There's about 25 races that have not been called yet. And Democrats are leading in a lot of those races right now, but they would need to really come from behind. I mean, right now they are 12 seats behind. And considering that they appear to be on track to lose a seat that Republicans are on track to win a seat in Iowa that Democrats had hoped to flip, that has not been called yet. And there are a few others like that. It's going to be hard for Democrats to get to that 218 number. Now, we could be in a situation, though, where it is 218 to 217, which would be incredibly narrow. And, you know, anyone sidelined by something or appointed to the administration could really throw things into chaos. So it's going to be a tight majority no matter who has it.
Well, in the Senate, the majority isn't quite as tight. We still, as we mentioned, have 2 seats that have not yet been called. But right now, as it stands, it's 43 Democrats, 53 Republicans. One of those 53 being Dave McCormick, who, according to the Associated Press, won the Senate seat in Pennsylvania against incumbent Democrat Bob Casey. And this was McCormick delivering an acceptance speech.
I also recognize what it's like to lose a close election. I lost an election. I lost an election by 900 points. So, we knew on election night we had won because the math was clear, and there's no way for Senator Casey to win. And the AP certainly recognized that yesterday by calling the race. But Senator Casey is going to have to work through this. And so I wish him the best.
An allusion to Dr. Oz there, I believe, Jonathan Tamari. But you obviously know the state of Pennsylvania well. McCormick did not win this one by much either, 0.5 percentage point. So this is going to a recount, right?
It appears to be going to a recount. The thing is, as the votes come in, it's starting to move just above that 0.5 percentage point victory. I think the last time I looked, it was something like maybe 0.54, which would be outside recount territory. There are still more ballots to be counted, so that could bring it within a recount. But it's around a 35 to 38,000 vote gap. It seems like that's way too far. It's way too many votes that to make up. It appears very rarely does a recount find that many votes to switch. But so whether or not it gets into that automatic threshold, I think will depend on counting some of these final ballots and some of these provisional ballots that may or may not be counted because they may have certain flaws in them that may disqualify them.
Interesting, Megan, to see how the McCormick campaign is handling this. They kicked out a fundraising email earlier today that says the election is over, but that has not stopped my opponent, Bob Casey, and the National Democrat machine from organizing and fundraising to try to force a recount. The subject line on this email is, Democrats refuse to accept the Pennsylvania results, and I need your help. Will Republicans be able to turn the tables on the Stop the Steal argument here?
So I don't think Democrats are necessarily getting to a Stop the Steal point here. Casey has
Well, no, isn't he trying to make it look like that, though?
Conceded. He certainly is, yes. McCormick certainly is. But McCormick has also, interestingly, filed a lawsuit demanding that that provisional ballots in Philadelphia, where Casey would be, would get a majority of the votes, presumably, that they stop counting those votes. So there's a lot of intrigue and interest going on with this race because it is so close and because Pennsylvania was such a prize of this entire election. If McCormick does go on to win, and it certainly looks like he's going to, he's unseating, the scion of a Pennsylvania political dynasty. The Casey name in Pennsylvania is akin to the Kennedy name in Massachusetts. So it's a real upset, and both sides aren't going to let this go easily.
All right, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari, thank you both so much. Still ahead, we'll look at the international impact of Donald Trump's tariff proposals with Doug Rediker of International Capital Strategies. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The overarching problem is a lack of reciprocity. And there's a historic reason for this. If you go back to World War II, we were trying to move economies like Japan's economy, like European economies, toward America. We didn't want them turning toward communism. We cut very favorable trade deals with them as a result. We have fully formed economies, developed economies, that are trading in ways that are very advantageous to them, not so to us. America's got the most open economy in the world. Access to this economy deserves fair treatment, reciprocity. We haven't been getting that, and I think this is an opportunity to come back and address it.
Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, seen as a candidate for Treasury Secretary or even Secretary of State, weighing in on President-elect Trump's proposed tariff plans here on Balance of Power last night. And joining us now on this Friday on Bloomberg TV and radio for a closer look at these proposals is Doug Rediker, former chief economist at the State Department and founder and managing partner of International Capital Strategies. Doug, a very happy Friday to you. Of course, the president-elect has put forward a lot of ideas around tariffs on the campaign trail, from a blanket tariff on all imports to 100% tariffs in some cases in some goods coming from some countries. For all of that, what's likely to actually become reality?
Well, first of all, Trump has been very obvious, very blatant, very clear that he believes that tariffs are his favorite word in the English language and costless. And whether it's his favorite word or not, I can't really say, but they are certainly not costless. So as he's gone from 10% to 20%, as he's gone from, at one point it was John Deere, I think 100%, then 200%, then at one point he said 1,000%. You know, these are figures that are just rhetorical, we hope, in terms of the approach. The approach is, I'm going to use a very blunt weapon. I'm going to use tariffs to advance American primacy in the world, and I'm daring anybody else to come back and reciprocate, retaliate. And of course, everybody else is probably going to do exactly that. So I think what we can expect is an immediate imposition of across-the-board tariffs within the first days or weeks upon Trump taking office in January, probably under IEEPA. That's the International Economic Emergency Policy Act, which basically allows the president almost unilateral discretion without any limits whatsoever if he declares an international economic emergency. If he does that, that's across the board. That's pretty dangerous. That's pretty debilitating to a lot of specific interests. But where it's really going to hit the road is when everybody else comes back and retaliates. So on that basis, I expect Europe to be the primary target and Europe to be one of the first to come back and retaliate. On China specifically, there's this other pool of up to 60% tariffs that he's discussed. And that's a whole different ballgame. There are different authorities he would use to actually impose that. But China has a very big presence, not only in the U.S., but obviously as an economic player around the world. And if Trump decides to go head-to-head with China, I think the first term of Trump, China was reluctant to engage on a tit-for-tat basis. I'm not sure they're going to show that reluctance this time. And in fact, I think a lot of people misunderstand what it is China can do back. It's not just tariffs for tariffs. They have their own new, the equivalent of export controls that they can levy across the board, across the world. It's going to be very dangerous if they go down this route.
Across the world is the point here, Doug Rediker. Say Donald Trump takes office and signs a flurry of executive actions on his first day, the way we saw in 2016. The Trump Sharpie is back. Across the board tariffs. Knowing the isolationist approach, if I can use that word, of this campaign become administration, and knowing the isolationist trends that we're seeing throughout Europe and around the world, are we on the precipice of a geopolitical ice age?
Oh, I don't think it's an ice age. I think you're going to see some reversion to previous iterations of, different alliances. I think that the U.S.-led world order, so let's call it the halcyon days of after the fall of the Berlin Wall and when the U.S. was the world's sole superpower, I think those days are over, not only because China poses a threat as a competing superpower, but because we're not really stepping up our game. In fact, under some of the rhetoric and the policies we expect, we will probably be looking at a number of countries that would normally have been in the U.S. camp that will scratch their heads and say, well, wait a minute, if you're treating us as, if not antagonists, at least certainly not allies, then should we play a little bit more of a non-aligned role, even if they don't call it that? So I think you're looking at a world in which a lot of alliances, again, alliances being the operative word here, I don't think Donald Trump prizes alliances. I think he views most relationships as bilateral and win-lose. So if you can negotiate a deal and Trump feels he got the better end of it, that's good. If it's a multilateral alliance thing, then he sort of shuns that. So I think in general, you're looking at an upended world order. You're looking at a world order in which the U.S. certainly plays a dominant role, but it's not going to be the dominant role. And I think we're going to be up for some surprises when countries we've always relied upon suddenly have to be a little more nuanced. Give you a quick example. If we do this tariff thing, you could see the EU, Canada, Japan, and China ally against us in taking a claim that we did this in violation of WTO rules at the WTO. That's a pretty strange alliance where you have the EU, the UK, Japan, Canada, and China allying against them.
It's quite a world to imagine. I want to add another part of the world into the conversation as well. When we look at the Middle East, the open arms with which Benjamin Netanyahu accepted this news of Donald Trump becoming president-elect, I wonder how you're looking at policy there in particular, knowing how crucial stability in that region is for the global flow of energy, things that do have an impact on inflation.
Yeah, how much time you got? I mean,
I wish we had more, Doug. Give it to me in 90 seconds.
I mean, look, the Middle East is going to be one of the most important and complicated areas because Trump and Netanyahu have a very nuanced relationship. It's not just because Netanyahu called Biden and congratulated him, but the U.S.-Saudi relationship is tough. Obviously, there's the Abraham Accords, which Trump takes full credit for and deserves it. But the relationship with Iran, we've already heard that there's going to be the maximum pressure campaign possibly ramping up again. So all of this is extremely complicated, and I'm not sure that we know where it's going to go. I don't think that Trump wants to inherit a fragmented Middle East. I think he would much prefer to have it, quote, settled before he takes office. But I'm not sure that the Bridge Colby view of the world, one of the possible Trump administration officials who wants us to move away from the Middle East and focus solely on China, I'm not sure that's just going to be able to be implemented given the facts on the ground in the Middle East. It's too complicated.
Does Donald Trump lower sanctions or eliminate sanctions against Russia or help it reconnect with the international banking system?
I think Trump views everything as a deal that's just waiting to be had. And I think that the end of the Ukraine war, if it comes, will include some element of sanctions because Russia is going to insist upon it. But remember, those sanctions are imposed not just by the U.S., but they're imposed by the EU and other G7 allies as well. So this is going to be, again, much more complicated. And there are a number of sanctions against Russia that could, and I emphasize the word could, be ramped up by the Biden administration in the coming days. And some of those are going to be harder to roll off than simply an executive order. But let's see. I think it's going to be on the table, but I don't think Trump's going to give it away. I think he could give it away, but he's not going to give it away right away.
Doug, it's great to have you back. Doug Rediker, at the end of this election week, he's former chief economist for the State Department, founder and managing partner of International Capital Strategies. Thank you, as always, for the insights. Coming up, Elon Musk joins a phone call between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskiy. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Let me tell you, we have a new star. A star is born, Elon. Now he is. Now he's an amazing guy. We were sitting together tonight. You know, he spent 2 weeks in Philadelphia and different parts of Pennsylvania campaigning.
Some thought he was a star even before Wednesday morning. That was President-elect Donald Trump praising Elon Musk. Yes, early Wednesday morning as he declared victory in the presidential race. We're already learning now about the potential impact he may have on a second Trump administration. Musk reportedly joining Donald Trump on a call with Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, to discuss the country's war with Russia. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Iain Marlow in Washington. Iain, what's going on here? Why was he on the call, and is this the new normal?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people who are familiar with the first Trump administration, this was an immediate refresher that foreign policy under Trump can be chaotic, just don't know what to expect. Lots of big personalities involved, and lots of surprises. And I think what we've heard from the campaign, people who have talked to my colleagues at Bloomberg, kind of suggesting that this was very informal. That Trump kind of, when he takes a call and someone else is in the room, he'll throw them on as well. Obviously, Musk has some connections to Ukraine in the sense that they're using his Starlink satellite internet services to stay online, and some of the troops are using them as well. So there's a bit of that there. Obviously, a lot of people are expecting Trump to take a huge turn on Ukraine, try and force some kind of negotiations. So an early call with Zelensky is interesting. It seemed to have gone fairly well from the Ukrainian side of things. So not clear exactly which way we're going to expect Trump to necessarily go right away on Ukraine. So yeah, it's just an interesting development, and one more reminder that we're in for a lot of surprises.
Well, and we were all surprised just a week or two ago when there was reports about these conversations that had private conversations between Elon Musk and Vladimir Putin. And it does raise the question as to whether Musk is going to end up being some kind of mediator between these two sides here.
Yeah, it's he has close connections in China as well, and so that came up when people were talking about Taiwan. Musk is a strange operator, world's richest man. He has a lot of business connections and a lot of ties, and a lot of people wondering whether this is the guy who should be crafting U.S. foreign policy. Is he just going to be cutting budgets and staff, or is he going to be, involved in some of this decision making? It's all kind of to be seen, and I think there's a lot of worries out there about what Trump will do when it comes to Ukraine, especially in Europe. What kind of connections, Trump and Elon both have to Putin, and I think at the moment we just don't really know. I think they're probably keeping the cards pretty close to their chest here, and I think we're probably just going to have to wait and see exactly what comes down. But again, people are expecting some kind of forced negotiation, Ukraine potentially giving up territory. So it's not looking great for Ukraine, but I think some conservative thinkers are suggesting that Trump could pull out some surprises when it comes to Ukraine, and so we're not there yet to some degree.
All right, Bloomberg's Iain Marlow, thank you so much for joining us. Always appreciate your reporting. And on the subject of Elon Musk, I would point out, Joe, for the first time since 2022 today, his net worth has topped $300 billion. Of course, comes at a time in which we're seeing shares of companies he has great shareholding in, like Tesla, rallying on the best week for the S&P 500 in a year this week. A
50th all-time high today. Pretty amazing. $300 billion. This was a very lucrative week for Elon Musk as well as Donald Trump.
And our coverage of this week is not over. We're going to have more on the courts next with Elizabeth Wydra of the Constitutional Accountability Center right here on Bloomberg.
It is essential to our national security that these cases be able to play out, but we do have Supreme Court decisions that established immunity, so those limitations exist, and it's going to have to be sorted out on the federal cases that remain.
Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida on the early edition today of Balance of Power, discussing the pending federal criminal case against President-elect Donald Trump. With more, we're joined by Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. It's great to have you back. Remarkable development today, but I guess not a very surprising one. A federal judge has paused the election interference prosecution against Donald Trump after Jack Smith made a request essentially to wind down the case. Is this now over?
It is basically over. There is a well-established principle through the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice that you do not pursue criminal prosecutions of sitting presidents, which Donald Trump is about to be once again. So it is to be expected that Jack Smith would start making moves in the D.C. case to wind that down. That's the election interference case. And again, also the Florida mishandling of classified documents and intelligence case will also no longer be a legal headache for Donald Trump.
Well, so obviously there's a lot of conversations that are thinking about how history could have been rewritten if decisions were made on different timelines, Elizabeth, including the departure of Joe Biden from his re-election campaign, but also how long it took to bring these cases in the first place. Was that the big misstep in the multiple prosecutions of Donald Trump, as they just waited too long to bring the charges?
Well, I think, there's obviously a lot that can be said in hindsight, but, I think there were multiple avenues for accountability for Donald Trump here. Certainly in the jury box, he was held accountable for 34 felony counts in a New York courtroom with the New York jury. And also there was the ballot box, and he was voted out in 2020. But even with all the evidence about his attempt to overturn the 2020 election and fanning the flames of the January 6th insurrection, the voters spoke at the ballot box and decided not to hold him accountable with their votes. And so I think, whether the cases would have brought earlier or not, we knew so much of this evidence, particularly about the January 6th case, from the January 6th special committee. And also Jack Smith did file papers that, gave these facts to the American people. So the facts were out there largely through the January 6th special committee. He was already a convicted felon in the New York case. So I'm not sure that it would have necessarily mattered to the people who voted for him.
Well, I'm just curious, before we move on to another matter here, will there be a Smith report beyond anything that we've seen? Will there be a document that brings a comprehensive summary of the evidence to Americans?
Well, there is going to be some sort of update report on December 2nd. We don't know exactly what that will hold. But again, we're not there. There doesn't seem to be, at least, although, certainly if it's secret, then we wouldn't know that it doesn't exist. But, there doesn't seem to be some sort of secret trove of evidence that wasn't out there. It was very clear that Donald Trump did try to overturn the 2020 election based on what was already presented to the public through the January 6th committee and in Jack Smith's previous filing. So, we're not in a situation where a lot of that evidence is undisclosed at this point. It is out in the public. So even if there is a report, I don't think, again, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's going to carry anything that is earth-shattering that hasn't already been put out there by Jack Smith or the January 6th committee.
Well, and of course, so much about this entire case had changed already based on the decision of the Supreme Court that Donald Trump had at least partial immunity for official acts. And it's to the Supreme Court I'd like to go next, Elizabeth. Now that we know that Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States, he could pick more justices. He's reflected on the fact that he got to pick 3 in his last term during his first administration. Just take a listen.
We had a great presidency. 3 Supreme Court justices. Most people get none. You pick them young. This way they're there for 50 years, right? So, even if a president is there for 8 years, oftentimes they never have a chance. I had 3. It was sort of the luck of the draw.
That was Trump speaking on the Joe Rogan podcast a few weeks ago, Elizabeth. But it is true. He could appoint a justice for life. And now there's conversation about Democrats potentially trying to push for Sonia Sotomayor to retire so they could appoint her replacement quickly before the next Congress is sat. Would that work?
Well, I think it's helpful to correct a little bit of what Donald Trump said. It wasn't just luck of the draw that he got to appoint so many justices. He was aided significantly by the Republican Senate refusing to go through the confirmation process for Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's initial nominee to the Supreme Court. And so he did get an extra seat because of that. And I think that is a cautionary tale as we're talking right now about strategies about working to try to get someone quickly on the bench. And, Justice Sotomayor has been a fantastic member of the court and continues to be a fantastic member of the court. And there's no indication that she is thinking of retiring anytime soon. Now, certainly, Donald Trump has remade the Supreme Court and many of the lower courts already in his first term. And we are likely to see even more, even if not on the Supreme Court, conservative, younger jurists put on the bench. Right now, there is a 6-3 conservative supermajority, in part because of those picks made by Trump in his last administration. it seems unlikely that there would be any of the three more liberal justices retiring, but certainly if Justices Alito or Thomas were to retire, they'd be replaced by much younger, still just as conservative justices.
Well, that's why it strikes me that this is just different than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Justice Sotomayor is 70 years old. Why would she step down?
Yes, I think, she's a very active, very powerful in her writing, in her reasoning member of the court. And so I don't think there's, I certainly have not gotten any indication that she is thinking of stepping down. That's obviously her decision. She lives in the real world like the rest of us. So if she wants to make that calculation, she is perfectly able to make that calculation herself. And, I can see the justification for wanting to have someone who could be on the bench for, maybe 40 years or, 50 years, depending on how well they take care of themselves, by having someone new take her place. But she is a very powerful, effective member of the court. And, it is her decision to make.
Well, Donald Trump's not going to get another 40 years in office, Elizabeth. He'll get 4 of them, but he walks into that 4 having at his back the decision I mentioned earlier that he does have partial immunity for official acts taken as president. Can you just characterize the power that gives him as he gets ready to take the oath on January 20th?
Yes. So I think that speaking of Justice Sotomayor, the dissenters in that presidential immunity case laid out very well the extremely dangerous potential for what could happen with that sweeping, unprecedented immunity that the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court has given Donald Trump. He's already telegraphed that he is not interested in following the dictates of the Constitution. And so knowing that he has this immunity given to him by his conservative Supreme Court certainly is only going to embolden him and not hold him back. But, the law exists. There are people who will be trying to hold him accountable to the law, going into the courts and asking them to serve their vital constitutional role as a check on the president, and hoping that the courts live up to that. Although with that decision that you mentioned about sweeping presidential immunity for official acts, there is reason to be skeptical that the Supreme Court is up to the task of being that check on the president. But nonetheless, that is their job under the Constitution, and it's appropriate for Americans to demand that they live up to that role.
All right, Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, thank you for joining us. Coming up, we'll take a look at the Trump transition as his potential cabinet comes into focus. Our political panel joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Speculation is swirling around who Donald Trump might be eyeing for roles in his new administration, following, of course, yesterday's announcement naming Susie Wiles as his incoming White House chief of staff. Joining us now for more is this evening's political panel, Lester Munson, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group, and Republican strategist, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Lester, to begin with you, we've obviously got a few names in the mix here. The Financial Times reporting today Robert Lighthizer will resume his role as the U.S. Trade Representative. Linda McMahon will be Commerce Secretary, according to the FT, or at least is being looked at. And Bloomberg is reporting now Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama, who chairs the Armed Services Committee in the House, could end up being at the head of defense. What do you make of the picks so far?
I think these are fairly sensible picks. I'm also impressed by President-elect Trump choosing Susie Wiles to be his chief of staff. That would be the first woman chief of staff in American history in the White House. That's a positive sign. These are conservatives, to be sure, but also pragmatic politicians and individuals who have shown, I think, some competence. Lighthizer, of course, is well known as a bit of a protectionist, so I'm not in total accord with him on some of those issues. But I think we've seen the rollout of some well-known figures this seems positive to me, certainly compared to 8 years ago when it was a little more helter-skelter.
Do some of these names feel more establishment, give you comfort, as opposed to bringing the inner circle into the White House, something more we saw the likes of in 2016?
The idea of Trump's cabinet, the word comfort doesn't come to my mind, Joe, I have to say, not surprisingly. But I do agree with Lester, is that they're not quite unexpected. So that is a positive. I mean, Donald Trump knows that he has to get all of these folks on the cabinet through confirmation. And of course, he has a Republican Senate. We don't know what that final number will be, but he is on track to do that. And of course, Susie Wiles apparently made an agreement. She was going to keep the crazy clowns out of the White House and out of these appointments. So that's a positive thing. But I do think we have to wait and see, because one other thing we are hearing is that we may see some folks who were under indictment not that long ago who can't make confirmation, who end up in the White House where they don't need to be vetted. So I'm going to hold my, comfort feelings for a little while. I'm not feeling comfortable, Joe Matthew.
I understand that.
But it's just been a few days.
Yes, that's right.
She may not be feeling comfortable, Lester, but she is making some fair points, especially in regard to confirmation by the Senate, which we do know is going to be a Republican majority. We're not sure about that in the House yet, even though it is looking likely. Even if it happens, it could be a very narrow majority, the kind of which we've been dealing with for the last 2 years. And I wonder about polling from the House when the majority is that tight. Is that something you would tell as an administration is wise?
Well, I think they're going to have trouble with legislative initiatives, more trouble than they think in the first 6 months. If there is indeed a 2 or 3 or even a 5-vote majority for Republicans in the House, that's still pretty tenuous. Your point is excellent. We saw how chaotic that can be this year. I would say Speaker Mike Johnson seems to be maturing every day in office. I think he's done a good job of riding this tiger. So I take a little bit of solace in the fact that it looks like he's going to continue in that position and continue to show leadership. He's a young, dynamic politician. He seems to know where are the important touch points for him. So while I think we should be very sanguine about the possibilities of House Republicans pushing through an aggressive legislative agenda, it's not going to be total chaos either.
I want to get back to this idea of Mike Rogers, Alabama's Mike Rogers.
Right.
As defense secretary, it's been reported that he would like to bring the first $1 trillion defense budget to the fore on Capitol Hill. What would Democrats do with a request like that?
I think there is going to be room to maneuver on that. I think given the state of the world today, it is not a crazy proposition to say that amount of spending. But I also think when we're going to spend that much, the reality is what Donald Trump proposed during the campaign doesn't add up. You are going to cut taxes. You are going to raise tariffs. You're going to keep inflation down. I mean, this math does not work. So you want $1 trillion to be spent in the defense. OK, how are you making that up if you're going to be, cutting taxes and doing all the other things you propose to do? So that's going to be Democrats' big question. Tell us how this works, and do it without destroying the social safety net, which also isn't a sound way to approach. And by the way, we have $37 trillion in debt at this point. How do you deal with that? So the math does not work. I'm OK with the spending, but you got to make that, not you, Joe, but not you, Kaylee. Somebody's got to make that up. And I think that's what Democrats will ask.
Well, I also just have a question about that price tag, Lester. If Donald Trump is to be believed, the wars that are currently ongoing will end quickly under his administration. No one will want to start a new war when he is president. What do we need $1 trillion for if the world's going to be at peace?
Well, I kind of like the idea of speak softly and carry a big stick. A big stick probably does cost $1 trillion these days. So that does not seem unreasonable to me. I think to your point, Kaylee, what is war these days? How do you know that the war in Gaza or Lebanon has ended? I don't think the Israelis are going to take tactical advice from the White House, no matter who the president is. They're going to continue to pursue the things they need to pursue. And I think at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to end up supporting them. In Ukraine, that might be a different question. And there might be an opportunity for some kind of settlement if That's frankly not going to make the strongest supporters of Ukraine happy, nor will it likely make whatever supporters there are of Moscow happy. The Ukrainians have gained some ground. Maybe this is an opportunity with Trump coming into office for there to be some kind of settlement. There'll be a lot of questions about the value of it, but the time may be ripe.
Our panel stays with us. Coming up, we'll take a look at the future of the Supreme Court under a Trump 2.0. We'll have much more ahead with Lester and Jeannie on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congresswoman, should President Biden pardon Donald Trump before he leaves the White House?
I'm not going to be here and tell President Biden what he should do. I personally don't think there should be pardons coming in these cases. These are very, very serious crimes that he's committed. The cases should play out under the rules that the Supreme Court has structured. And so, no, I don't think that President Biden should be pardoning him.
Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz on the future of President-elect Trump's pending federal criminal cases. She made those comments today on the early edition of Balance of Power. And back with us, our panel, Lester Munson and Jeannie Shanzano, to whom I will ask the same question. Jeannie, Joe Biden's not very popular right now. Why not pardon Donald Trump before he leaves the White House to help to heal the nation?
You know, I don't think the president should. I think we let the Justice Department do its job. We've already seen Jack Smith move forward on this. Those cases will go away. The New York case, the Georgia case, I hope and suspect they will do the same. Obviously, a pardon wouldn't impact those anyway.
That's true.
But I don't think that that would serve any interest at this point. I say let the Justice Department do the work that it has promised, and that it says that it has a rule. It would not pursue this, and they should not, and that's enough.
Do you have a take on that, Lester?
Yeah, I kind of wonder if President-elect Trump would even accept a pardon, and I'm not sure what the process is. Can he say no to a pardon from Joe Biden? I suspect in his heart of hearts he doesn't want to think that he needs any kind of favor from Joe Biden. So I think there's kind of a weird alpha male dynamic here that may be at play.
Well, so as we consider here the legal world or the judicial and justice system, Jeannie, we also were having a conversation just a few minutes ago with Elizabeth Wydra of the Constitutional Accountability Center about what the makeup of the Supreme Court could ultimately look like under a second Trump administration. He got 3 justices last time around. He could get more this time. Should Democrats be trying to push out Sonia Sotomayor?
No, absolutely not. First of all, there is no time, for Democrats. I know they're frustrated with what has happened, but the idea that between now and January 3rd, that they would be able to nominate and confirm a new Supreme Court justice. Joe Biden has 30 appointments waiting to be confirmed. It's not going to happen time-wise, and it doesn't make sense. She is, I believe, the third oldest member of the court.
70,
Clarence Thomas, you've got Alito Thomas, and I suspect that Clarence Thomas may, after 34 years, think about retiring, but she should not. I think this is Democrats scrambling. It is not the same as RBG. That was a different scenario. No way at this point. I'm putting my foot down, Kayleigh.
It's not going to happen, it sounds like.
Lester, where's your foot on this?
I suspect Jeannie's correct. There's just not enough time to nominate, vet, and confirm a new Supreme Court justice at this time. It would be a fool's errand.
Lester, you have that look of someone who won. How do you feel this Friday after the election?
My candidate did not win, Joe. I supported the Libertarian ticket, which I think at the time I knew was kind of doomed. I guess I'm feeling what a lot of Americans are feeling, which is we're kind of pregnant with possibility here. There's a chance that the second Trump term is a more constructive and more level-headed one than the first Trump term. And I think we're all kind of hopeful that some of these appointments and his behavior will be better for all Americans going forward. I realize that we're likely to hit rocky shores on that probably in the fairly near future. But for now, I think it's not unreasonable to be a little bit optimistic.
All right, Lester Munson, our Republican libertarian strategist this evening, and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, our Democratic strategist. Thank you both. Enjoy the weekend. It is certainly well-deserved. It has been quite a week,
yes,
Joe. And, of course, for coverage of all of the crazy weeks in Washington, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Let's get back to Washington. We'll see you from there on Monday. Thanks for being with us all week on Balance of Power. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.